Yesterday, 46-year-old George Floyd lost his life as a result of police brutality. And in an incident in Minneapolis, Minnesota, Mr. Floyd was going to a store to cash a check when a store owner believed that Mr. Floyd was giving them a bad check and decided to call police on him. Now, according to the New York Times, the police found Mr. Floyd sitting on a car, and he was appearing to be allegedly inebriated. And according to them, they had a struggle with Mr. Floyd and managed to get him in handcuffs, and they left him on the ground, and this officer was resting his knees on Mr. Floyd's neck for over 9 minutes. Now, when I take a critical examination of this incident, I clearly see racial profiling that escalated into police brutality. And the racial profiling by that store owner was the thing that led to that police brutality, because this store owner, I believe, was doing what many store owners out here do when they are racist. When they see a black man with a check, they don't believe that that check was made out to that black man, and because they are racist, they go out here and escalate things by calling the police on that black man. So this store owner, I believe, was the one that instigated this incident by racially profiling Mr. Floyd in believing that this check was not allegedly his, and this escalation is what led to these police officers going out here to approach Mr. Floyd. And once they approached Mr. Floyd, then this led to a further escalation and led to Mr. Floyd having this confrontation with the police officers. And then after that, he had that struggle and they put him in handcuffs, led to this race soldier putting his knees on his neck and looking to passively, as he relates to a resisting arrest, saying that they were trying to restrain him, but aggressively looking for a way to do harm to Mr. Floyd. Now, Mr. Floyd, again, was on the ground for 9 minutes with this man resting most of the weight of his body on Mr. Floyd's neck, and this was going to restrict George Floyd's breathing. And in the video, it is clearly stated that Mr. Floyd said he couldn't breathe, and I believe that he couldn't breathe because he was already, one, dealing with the anxiety of possibly being arrested, which was making him extremely nervous and making him really anxious, and two, he was having this man's knees on his neck, the full weight of his body, restricting his ability to breathe. And that was shown by the blood coming down out of his nose. This man was put in extreme distress by, as I see it, the willful and malicious actions by these police officers, who I believe clearly used excessive force. Now, there were 4 officers on that detail, and one of those other 3 officers could have easily told one of their partners to take your knees off this man's neck. We already have him handcuffed. We already have him restrained. All we have to do is place this individual in a squad car in the back. That's all they had to do, was put him in a caged car, and that would have been the end of it. But no, these officers did not follow procedure, and this use of excessive force is what escalated this incident of racial profiling, I believe, into a murder. Because when I look at the actions of that officer who put his knees on George Floyd's neck, I see malice of forethought, and I see clear, willful, and intentional efforts to do harm to George Floyd. Because, again, for a simple incident like this, there was no need to use this much force. And when I take a further critical examination of this incident, it's really troubling that 6 years after the passing of Eric Garner at the hands of Daniel Pantaleo, that we see yet another black man winding up losing his life in a similar fashion because a police officer who used excessive force managed to go out here and do this to another man. And again, I really hold our government responsible for this, because had your Barack Obama done something about Daniel Pantaleo the same way he could have done something about George Zimmerman, it could have set policy to prevent the deaths of George Floyd the same way it could have prevented the death of Ahmaud Arbery. Because when I look at your Barack Obama and the policy he had Loretta Lynch implement as related to Eric Garner, what she did, instead of filing federal civil rights charges against Daniel Pantaleo for choking out Eric Garner, was she let the clock run out on that case as the Obama administration was coming to an end, and she allowed this policy to continue to go on. And that's really the most troubling thing about this whole George Floyd incident, was it could have easily been prevented by our first black president and our second black attorney general. But because of their inaction, this is what is leading to more black men losing their lives, because that president, during his time running the executive branch, did not want to create executive policy to protect the rights and freedoms of black men who were being brutalized by these white police officers. And by him doing that, he set that as the law of the land for the United States. So your Barack Obama, I believe, is partially responsible for the deaths of Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd, because these incidents, again, mirror that of what happened to Trayvon Martin and what happened to Eric Garner. And again, had the executive branch gone out and implemented policy to set a line in the sand as related to these brutal police officers, and set a line in the sand as related to policy, then maybe these men might still be alive today. Because when I look at this incident again, it shows us that history, sadly, is repeating itself. And again, this man lost his life because of this racial profiling, which escalated into police brutality. And what's even more disturbing is that most people don't see how this vicious cycle is starting to repeat itself. And what's even more troubling to me is that it seems like your Trump administration is taking more action than the Obama administration did 8 years ago or 6 years ago in the case of Eric Garner. And instead of running the clock out, they're having the FBI investigate for federal civil rights charges, the same type of federal civil rights charges that should have been filed against George Zimmerman and Daniel Pantaleo. Now, according to the left-leaning Minneapolis mayor, he has fired all 4 of these police officers, but I can see through that smokescreen, because what's happening here is he wants to make it appear like he's doing something, but in actuality, the police union, what they're going to do is petition to keep these officers on the job and keep them on the payroll. So people have to take a critical examination of these actions. Yes, they fired them on the surface to make things appear like they're doing something, but in actuality, what they want to do, again, is run the clock out. And then after they run the clock out, then reinstate these same officers and have them go back to doing the same types of racial profiling and police brutality to black men. But the whole thing is that what I find really sad is this man could have easily been me, because I'm 46 years old, and I could easily have been a George Floyd. I mean, the same thing could have happened with Ahmaud Arbery. I see the same myself in his shoes because all it takes is one black man being in the wrong place and he could possibly lose his life. And that's the really scary thing about George Floyd is that here's a black man who was a working class brother paying his bills and just looking to get some money and be able to continue taking care of himself because George Floyd had just been laid off. He had been working in a restaurant that had been closed due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And this man was just looking to take care of some business. And this is what happens when a black man goes out here. And that's the really scary thing about George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery is that it's just everyday things can lead to a black man losing his life. And that's something, as a 46-year-old man, I have had to live with all of my life, is knowing that any day I go out here could be my last day on earth. And seeing what happened to George Floyd lets me know that nothing has really changed as related to that whole principle that I have grown up with, living with my entire life. Because when I look at George Floyd again, I see myself in Ahmaud Arbery, and I know that any time I go out here, it could be me out here dead like these black men. And again, doing things that every other brother goes out here and does. And again, your George Floyd, he was just going there to cash a check, and it turns out that he winds up dead. And that's the really scary thing about living here in America is that we see more and more racism going on here as it's continuing to escalate. And while some people want to blame your Donald Trump for all of this racism, no, this racism has been a part of the culture of this country since its inception. And again, when I look at Barack Obama, I see the man who really, as I see it, could have done something about all of this, but just sat on his hands. And instead of him drawing a line in the sand as related to black people's civil rights, he decided not to bring any hope and change to black people as related to their civil rights. And as a result, sadly, we lost these black people. George Floyd lost his life. Ahmaud Arbery lost his life. And what I find was sad is everybody will give your Barack Obama a pass for not implementing this policy, but your George Herbert Walker Bush, one of the biggest racists out here, managed to file federal civil rights charges against the 4 officers who beat up Rodney King. And it looks like your President Donald Trump and his FBI is looking to do the same in investigating this case. So what is wrong with Barack Obama, and why didn't he do things to protect the rights of black people? And that's the critical question most black people need to ask regarding your Barack Obama and his ineffectiveness as related to protecting black people's civil rights. Because when I look at the murder of George Floyd, and it is a murder because, again, I see malice of forethought and willful intent to do harm to this man by a member of law enforcement. I see a murder, and this man needs to be charged with first-degree murder because he murdered George Floyd. And he murdered George Floyd because he wanted to do harm to a black man who he believed was nothing but trouble. But this was just a working-class brother looking to cash a check, pay his bills, and try to survive this COVID-19 pandemic and the damage it did to our economy. And that's the thing that's really damaging is that we don't see George Floyd as another American citizen out here looking to pay his bills and take care of himself. No, people in that store saw him as a criminal, and they projected this stereotype onto him that he was looking to pass a bad check on him. And again, that's an old racist stereotype about black men, sort of like the other racist stereotype about black men having $100 bills and $50 bills. It means that they're criminals. And that's not the case at all. George Floyd, as I see it, was just trying to take care of himself during a pandemic, trying to pay his bills, trying to do what he needed to do. And instead of him getting support from his community, he got racially profiled and brutally murdered by the police. And that's the most troubling thing about this incident, is that this black man was not seen as a human being. He was treated as less than a human being, and his civil rights were completely violated by this store owner, by this police, and they don't really understand how nothing has really changed from the days of Eric Garner, the days of Trayvon Martin, and how nothing has really changed since the days of Emmett Till. So when I look at America and its whole racism issue, it's really nothing has changed in the last 50 years. And in fact, things are regressing and not progressing. And they are regressing because we don't want to acknowledge how racist this country is, how it was founded on a foundation of white supremacy. And what's being reflected back at us is the same racism and white supremacy no one wants to acknowledge, and no one wants to acknowledge this suburban terrorism that goes on, calling itself law enforcement, because this law, they have a covert contract where they get a pass for their bad behavior if they give these guys a pass for their bad behavior. So they don't want to admit that there's a problem here, but I can clearly see a problem here because the death of George Floyd mirrors the death of Eric Garner, and it shows us how little has changed in the last 6 years and how there will be no hope for America until it starts really taking a serious look at racism and how we have abused black people over the last 500 years. If you'd like to see me make more videos like this, you can donate to my Patreon, my PayPal, or my Cash App by clicking the links in the description box. And if you want to try some of my SJS Direct publications, you may do so by clicking the link to Amazon.com. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.